Well, good morning. Welcome again to our New York Fed's regional economic press briefing. I'm obviously pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you and through you to the people of our district. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss conditions in the national economy, and then I'm going to conditions in our region. And then obviously we're going to, as we noted, we're going to focus on private for-profit institutions in the education, which have become more important over time in U.S. higher education. As always, what I have to say reflects my own views and opinions and not necessarily those of the Federal Open Market Committee or the Federal Reserve System. So let me begin by taking stock of where we are at the moment. Then I'm going to talk about my expectations for performance of the economy in 2014 and 15. Since the end of what is now called the Great Recession in the middle of 2009, the U.S. economy has experienced 17 consecutive quarters of positive growth of real GDP. However, the compounding rate of growth over that period has only been around 2.25%, which is close to the prevailing estimates of the economy's long-term growth potential. Thus, we have made limited progress in closing the substantial output gap that was created during the recession. A similar conclusion is drawn from an assessment of labor market conditions, although the unemployment rate has declined about 2.75 percentage points from the peak of 10% in October of 2009. A significant portion of that decline reflects the substantial decline in the labor participation rate that's occurred over that period. It should also be noted that since the previous business cycle peak at the end of 2007, the decline in the labor force participation rate has been more than accounted for by the decline in participation in the prime working age group of 25 to 54 years old. The inflation data are also consistent with an overall picture of an economy that's operating well below its potential. Total inflation, as measured by the personal consumption expenditure deflator, has been quite volatile in recent years because of sharp fluctuations in energy prices. When we look at core inflation, which excludes the volatile food and energy components, and this may be a better guide to underlying inflation, that slowed from about 2% in early 2012 to just above 1% in the middle of 2013. In recent months, it has shown signs of stabilizing at about that rate, but it still remains well below the FOMC's expressed goal of 2% for total inflation. Now, fortunately, inflation expectations remain relatively stable at levels above the current inflation rate, and this stability should help prevent an undesirable further drop in inflation below our 2% inflation objective. That said, there are some national signs that the economy may be doing better. For example, based on the first estimate for third quarter GDP, we saw growth in the third quarter of 2.8% at an annual rate. That's above the trend of the past few years. And the most recent payroll employment report did show a pickup in the monthly pace of job gains. The 3-month moving average for payroll employment has moved back above a 2,000 pace per month after slowing to about 150,000 a month in the middle of this year. And I hope this marks a turning point for the economy. But before we rush to that conclusion, a few more cautionary comments are appropriate. With respect to GDP growth, it turns out that about 3/4 of a percentage point of the overall growth rate was due to inventory investment. Thus, because this impetus from inventories will turn out to be temporary and likely to reverse this quarter, we should expect that the real GDP growth rate in the fourth quarter will fall to 2% or a bit less. With respect to payroll employment growth, we have seen such bursts in the growth rate over the last few years and have been disappointed when the pickups in payroll employment growth proved to be temporary and were not followed by a rise in the overall growth rate of the economy. But I do have to admit I am getting more hopeful. Not only do we have some better data in hand, but also fiscal drag, which has been the key force holding the economy back, is likely to abate considerably over the next few years, at a time that the fundamental underpinnings for the U.S. economy are improving. The first thing to note is that federal fiscal policy in 2013 was unusually contractionary. At the beginning of the year, the payroll tax cut holiday ended, tax rates on higher income households were raised, a series of taxes associated with the Affordable Care Act took effect, and spending was reduced due to the sequester and the gradual decline in foreign military operations. So you put it all together, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the cyclically adjusted budget deficit contracted by 1.75 percentage points of GDP in fiscal year 2013. And that's a lot. Over the past 50 years, there's been only 2 other episodes of fiscal contraction of this order of magnitude, and both of those occurred when the unemployment rate was substantially lower than this time. Under the current law, the amount of fiscal federal restraint will decline in 2014 and then decline further in 2015. So it looks like the sustained contraction that's in federal fiscal policy that's been holding us back is going to gradually abate. At the same time, the sustained contraction in spending and employment at the state and local government level already appears to be over. So that occurred a little bit earlier, and that seems to have ended. Now, putting this all together, the fact that the U.S. economy has continued to grow at about 2% pace in 2013, despite this quite intense fiscal restraint, I think does provide evidence of the second point, which is that the private sector of the economy has largely completed its healing process and is now poised to ramp up in terms of its level of activity. Key measures of household leverage have declined and are now near the lowest levels they've been in well over a decade. Household net worth expressed as a percent of disposable income has increased back to the average of the previous decade. This reflects rising equity prices and home prices and declining debt. Recently, banks have eased credit standards somewhat after a prolonged period of tightness. So as a result, we're now seeing a fairly typical cyclical recovery of consumer spending on durable goods. So for example, when you look at the sales of lightweight motor vehicles, that's autos and light trucks, they've been rising steadily over the last 4 years, reaching an annual rate of 15.7 million in the third quarter of 2013. Those sales in September and October fell a little bit below that average. Similarly, after 5 years in which housing production was well below what's consistent with underlying demographic trends and the replacement demand for houses, it now appears we've worked off the excess supply of housing built up during the boom years of the last decade. Housing market activity has begun to recover, and a widely followed national home price index, the CoreLogic index, is up 12% over the last 12 months ending in September. Anecdotal reports suggest that the reason that home prices are going up relatively quickly is due to the relatively low number of homes that are actually available for sale. Due to this shortness in supply, there's reason to expect that we'll see an increase in starts going forward. Another bright spot on the horizon is the fact that the growth prospects of some of our major trading partners looks like it's starting to improve following several years of lackluster performance, which actually was bad for us because it induced a sharp slowing in the growth rate of U.S. exports. In particular, the euro area appears to have emerged from a protracted recession and is experiencing modest but positive growth. So to summarize, while growth in 2013 has been disappointing, I believe a good case can be made for the idea that growth will pick up some in 2014 and then somewhat more in 2015. The private sector of the economy should continue to heal while the amount of fiscal drag subsides. Despite near-term concerns, growth prospects among our major trading partners are likely to improve further next year. This combination of events is likely to create an environment in which business investment spending will strengthen. And as growth picks up, I expect to see a more substantial improvement in labor market conditions and a gradual updrift in inflation back towards the FOMC's target range. However, the notion that the economy will grow more swiftly remains a forecast rather than a reality at this point. And as always the case, there is substantial uncertainty surrounding this forecast. Moreover, there's always the possibility of some unforeseen shock. Thus, we're going to have to continue to monitor U.S. and global economic conditions very carefully, and we're going to adjust our views on the likely path for growth, inflation, and the unemployment rate accordingly. So now let me turn to the regional economy. A year has passed since Superstorm Sandy devastated the tri-state region. And even today, many of the hardest hit places are still struggling to recover and rebuild from the storm. We've seen reminders of the storm's damage visible in neighborhoods across Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, as well as along the coasts of Long Island and New Jersey. On a more encouraging note, however, the broader regional economy has proven to be remarkably resilient. After a brief dip following the storm, the regional economy rebounded quickly and has continued to add jobs at a reasonably good pace. Moreover, the region's housing markets have continued to show steady improvement throughout the year. Now, to help monitor the performance of the regional economy more generally, the New York Fed produces economic activity indexes for New York State, New York City, and New Jersey. And so based on these measures, what we see is that the New York City's economy has continued to grow strongly throughout the year. Both New York State and New Jersey have seen some pickup in growth in recent months. As a result, a growing number of places in the region have either recovered or are close to recovering the jobs that were lost during the Great Recession. More troubling, however, is that Puerto Rico's economy remains exceptionally weak. Activity and employment on the island continues to decline. Our economists will elaborate on these trends later this morning. Now let me turn to the issue of private for-profit institutions in higher education. The important role of post-secondary education is undeniable given the key role that human capital plays in supporting economic growth. However, higher education landscape comprises different types of post-secondary institutions that provide different educational experiences. One such group of institutions, private for-profit institutions, have progressively become more visible in U.S. higher education market. For-profit institutions and their growth in the market for student loans and federal need-based aid is the subject of the special topic we're going to consider today at today's briefing. Analysis done here at the New York Fed reveals that enrollment in for-profit colleges showed explosive growth nationally during and for some time after the Great Recession. Interesting, this growth in enrollment has leveled off perceptibly as the economic recovery has taken hold. These patterns suggest that workers who were displaced from their jobs during the Great Recession chose to enroll in two-year and less than two-year colleges, mostly in for-profits, but also in public community colleges. Now, with labor market conditions improving, individuals have less reason to seek out short-term degrees, and many have returned to the labor force. Stark patterns are also observed in the market for student loans. Both the incidence of student loans and the average loan size are far greater for for-profit institutions compared to comparable public colleges. Given the importance of post-secondary education in our nation's future, and the key role that human capital plays in supporting the nation's growth, we're going to continue to spend resources at the New York Fed to analyze the growth of private for-profits in particular and post-secondary institutions in general in the nation and for our region.